When General Motors recalled hundreds of thousands of cars in Canada and the U.S. in February, Transport Canada said it never knew about defective ignition switches that could suddenly turn off at high speed. Well, now our colleagues at the Fifth Estate and Radio-Canada's Enquête have learned there's evidence to suggest Transport Canada was aware of the deadly defect 8 months before GM issued its recall. The Fifth Estate's Bob McEwen has been investigating this and has tonight's report.
Each year, millions of vehicles are recalled. The public seldom knows about most. But the General Motors recall last February was different.
What happened to this GM car? Crappy little Cobalt.
What happened was that GM finally admitted what it had known for over a decade, that its compact cars like the Chevrolet Cobalt and Saturn Ion had a defective ignition switch that could suddenly rotate into the off position, cutting power for steering, brakes, and airbags. GM now acknowledges the switch is related to at least 29 fatalities. In all, it's facing claims for over 150 deaths, including that of 23-year-old Danny Dubuc-Marquis of Granby, Quebec, who died when his Chevy Cobalt left the road in June 2013 after a night of drinking with friends. Despite severe frontal damage to the car, police noticed the airbags hadn't deployed. They contacted Transport Canada, whose investigators also found Danny's ignition switch had rotated to the off position at some time during the crash.
We don't have information.
But since the GM recall last February, Federal Transport Minister Lisa Raitt has denied any prior knowledge of an ignition switch problem or a link to Danny Dubuc-Marquis' death.
Transport Canada was not aware of an ignition switch issue prior to receiving its first notice from GM Canada in February. Therefore, there was no connection made to that previous accident that the honourable member referred to that happened, unfortunately, in June of last year.
But according to documents we obtained, within days of the Dubuc-Marquis crash, 8 months before the recall, Transport Canada was investigating the possible connection between the GM ignition switch issue and the failure of the airbags to deploy. It was the subject of internal email, of this phone call, and apparently of a sharing of complaints, presumably including the ignition switch, with the manufacturer, General Motors. But then, for some reason, Transport Canada closed its investigation and sent the Chevy Cobalt in which Danny died to a local junkyard. And in the months before GM announced its recall, almost 400,000 vehicles remained on Canadian roads with that deadly switch in their ignition. We learned that one of those belonged to 55-year-old Danilo Kulish of Montreal, who died when his Saturn Ion went out of control last March.
He died for a 57-cent piece that should have been fixed over 10 years ago.
The Kulish family believes he might still be alive if Transport Canada had followed through and informed the public when it first realized there was a potential ignition switch problem, instead of waiting until after the GM recall.
Transport Canada should be its own independent organization and should be able to react accordingly to what is going on here. And they're nowhere to be seen or found.
That's some pretty serious criticism from the family.
Exactly, Peter. And both families, the Kulishes and the Dubucs, say that they're in the process of filing compensation claims with General Motors in the deaths of their loved ones. As for Transport Canada, it still has not released the results of its investigations into both fatal crashes.
You know, what puzzles me here is what power does Transport Canada have?
Yeah, that actually was one of the most surprising of a number of surprising things that came out of this investigation. Most Canadians, I think, might assume that our safety regulators have the power to order the recall of vehicles with potentially lethal defects like that ignition switch. It's like that in the U.S. But in fact, Transport Canada can only request a recall, which the manufacturer, like GM, can refuse. So in this case, south of the border, there are 2 ongoing congressional investigations into GM, another by the Department of Justice, and the company has been fined the maximum allowed by law, $51 million. In Canada, no official action whatsoever, at least not yet.
Fascinating story. Thanks, Bob. Bob McEwen.